Welcome to this week's Chinuch Hashkofa message. It's Parsha Shoftim. In this week's Parsha, we know there's a mitzvah of Minui Melech, to appoint a king, and there's a famous question that all the Mefarshim ask, which is why the Torah tells us that when you come to Eretz Yisrael and you'll want to appoint a king, and the Torah gives us a mitzvah of Minui Melech, to appoint a king. And yet we know, we read in the Sefer Shmuel, that when the Yidden came to Shmuel and they told him, give us a king, Shmuel was upset and he spoke to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he communicated with Hashem, and Hashem told him, don't worry, it's not you they're rejecting, it's me they're rejecting. In other words, the fact that they wanted a king seemed to be a negative thing. All the Mefarshim talk about it, and of course there are many, many answers. But there's a rather well-known Kli Yakar that I want to share with you, that I think is an important Kli Yakar hashkafically, and could be the basis of a very important discussion that we have with our children, and also reflection for ourselves. The Kli Yakar says it's very simple. You have to look at the wording. When it came to Shmuel, when it came to the Yidden going to Shmuel, they said, Simo lonu melech, give us a king. When it comes to this week's Parsha, it says, Soim tosim olecha melech, place a king upon you. And the Kli Yakar says, and he connects it not only to a king, he says this is the way sometimes communities, sometimes people appoint a Rav, a leader. What is their agenda? Are they appointing someone to be bottled to surrender to? Are they placing that leadership figure upon them, that they will give themselves over to them and listen to them? Or do they want them to work for them? Do they want the leader, he doesn't say these words, but do they want the Rav or the leader to be just a rubber stamp for whatever they want? They will sort of talk to him, they will tell him, they will guide him what to paskin, what to rule, what to say. And he says, as I mentioned, he talks about this in terms of how we relate to leaders, to Rabbonim, and so on and so forth. We all know, of course, that in Pirkei Avos there's a concept of Aseh L'Charav. Aseh L'Charav means everyone has to make for themselves a guide, a mentor, a ruchnistic mentor, someone they will ask advice from, they will seek advice from. And we know that the wording in the Pirkei Avos is Aseh L'Charav, which the Lubavitcher Rebbe once explained that Aseh comes from the language of Ma'asin al Tzedakah, to force upon you. In other words, place upon you, subjugate yourself to a Rav. And this is such a fundamental discussion, because it goes from the simplest things of how we ask a shaila to a Rav. Do we pressure the Rav what kind of heter we're looking for, what we want the Rav to paskin, or we just ask a simple shaila and we're ready to do whatever they're going to tell us to do, because that's what the Torah tells us to do. Or it can be something where we ask other people advice, or we're just asking people advice and trying to pressure them to tell us what we want to hear, or we're genuinely asking someone else because we know that we are korev eitzel atzmoi, we are related to ourselves, and therefore we are subjective, and we're asking objective advice, and therefore we're going to objective advice from someone that we trust and we look up to, but we're going to listen to them even if the answer is something we don't like, even if the answer is something that we didn't think of, or we don't think perhaps is that logical. And that's a discussion worth having, and it's a reflection also worth having in terms of how we run our homes. Do our children see that we respect authority? We're living in a world today where children are growing up in a world that doesn't respect authority, where we talk down at authority. We think authority are there just to serve us. And this is a discussion to have with children about what it means to have Aseh L'Charav, what it means to ask a Rav, what it means to have emunas tzaddikim. But also it's something that we need to really think about how we model this in our own homes. Do we always talk respectfully about people in authority? Do we share with our children when appropriate? And I think I've mentioned this before, but it's a really important strategy. To share with children when we have a shaila. You know, we went to ask a Rav, and this is what the Rav paskind. And sometimes the psak might be something hard. Might be something that's difficult to keep. But nevertheless, we share with our children. We ask the Rav, this is what the Rav says. There can be a discussion in a family about how something should happen, and children can argue amongst themselves sometimes, and sometimes it can be something which is relevant to halacha. It's a good chinuch to be able to tell children, let's ask a Rav. Let's call up a Rav. Let's ask what the Rav says. And do whatever the Rav says. Now, of course, when we say Rav, when we appoint a Rav, it has to be a Rav who we have a relationship with, who we respect, but not a Rav that's Tnolonu. Give us a Rav that will do everything that we want them to do. No. Obviously, it's someone we look up to, but it's got to be Soim Tosim Olecha. We got to place the Rav upon us. That we're always ready. When we ask a Shaila, doesn't matter what the answer is, we're ready to listen. And this is a fundamental concept in Chinuch, because it teaches children the idea of Kabbalah's oil, of listening to halacha. It teaches children this idea that the derech HaTorah that we take is not always something that we are comfortable with, but it's something that we look to beyond ourselves. We look to a higher authority, to someone who can guide us, even if the answer is not exactly what we want or we're comfortable with, because that is the way we connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, by always remembering that we are just small people, and we are people who need to go beyond ourselves and to subject ourselves to what Torah has to say. And one of the things we learn in this week's parsha, in fact, is Shoiftim v'shoikrim titin l'cha b'chol sharecha, that we have to follow advice of those that are able to give us that advice. We have to follow the psukim of those that are able to give us those piskei halacha, and be ready to listen and have that Kabbalah soil, an important chinuch message, an important chinuch discussion. Have a wonderful day and a very good Shabbos.